In the picturesque town of Santa Barbara, California, Sarah Turner's life seemed perfect on the surface. She lived in a charming little house by the beach with her loving husband David and their two children. Every morning the sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ocean, and Sarah went about her day tending to her family, her home, her garden, just like any ordinary person. Life felt peaceful, almost idyllic, and Sarah thought she had it all, a family, a home, the kind of life she had always dreamed of. But sometimes, even in the most perfect lives, a storm is brewing just below the surface. Sarah had always felt something strange, an inexplicable tension that lingered at the edges of her perfect world. It was subtle, something she could never quite name, a feeling that haunted her, quietly but persistently. Perhaps it was the weight of her own expectations or a longing she could never truly fulfill. But Sarah had learned to live with it, to push it away and focus on what mattered: her family, her husband, her children. She told herself there was no room for such dark thoughts in a life so full of light. But that was before Gregory came to visit. Gregory Turner, her father-in-law, was a man who was always distant, both physically and emotionally. He lived far away and visited only a handful of times each year. His presence was always brief, formal, and quietly unsettling. Sarah had never been able to understand him. His silence, his way of withdrawing into himself, it felt like an invisible wall between him and everyone else. Despite years of interaction, she never really got to know the man who was David's father, and for some reason she had never wanted to. There was something about Gregory that made Sarah uneasy, though she could never put her finger on why. But that night when Gregory arrived at their doorstep, unexpectedly, everything changed. The moment she opened the door to greet him, Sarah felt it, a coldness in the air, a subtle shift in the room. It was as though the world around her had tilted slightly, just enough to make her feel disoriented. Gregory's eyes met hers, and in that instant, Sarah felt something stir deep within her. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't blatant, but it was undeniable. Something was different, something had shifted, and she couldn't stop it. He was as calm and collected as ever, but there was something in the way he looked at her, a curiosity that felt too intense, too penetrating. Sarah tried to brush it off, to chalk it up to her own overactive imagination, but every glance he sent her way seemed to linger just a little too long. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and it was as if some invisible force was pulling them together in a way she couldn't resist. Dinner that evening was supposed to be just like any other family gathering, but the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. Sarah tried to focus on the conversation, to play the role of the perfect hostess, but her mind kept drifting back to Gregory. It wasn't even about the things he said or didn't say, it was the way he made her feel. As the evening wore on, the walls of her mind began to crumble, and an undeniable truth started to take root. Something was happening between them, something that was not supposed to happen. When the evening came to an end, and David suggested they all retire to their rooms, Sarah felt an odd sense of disappointment. She didn't want to leave, not because she wanted to spend more time with Gregory, but because she couldn't shake the magnetic pull she felt toward him. The moment she followed David to their bedroom, the thought of being alone with Gregory consumed her. That night she lay awake in bed, unable to find any peace. Her mind raced with thoughts of Gregory, of his gaze, of the inexplicable connection she couldn't ignore. It was as though a storm had been unleashed inside her, and no matter how much she tried to suppress it, she couldn't stop it. She tossed and turned the weight of what had happened and what might happen bearing down on her. Could she continue pretending like everything was fine? Could she ignore the fact that something somewhere had shifted? Sarah didn't know the answers, but one thing was for sure. Her life would never be the same after tonight. Question: do you think Sarah's feelings toward Gregory were purely based on attraction, or do you think there's a deeper connection between them? It's just attraction, nothing more. There's a deeper connection at play. Leave your answer in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories. Like this one, your support keeps us going and allows us to bring you more captivating videos in the future. The days following Gregory's arrival felt like a blur to Sarah. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt strangely alien, filled with an intensity she couldn't escape. The tension between her and Gregory simmered beneath the surface of every passing moment, an invisible force that clung to the air. It wasn't just a passing discomfort, it was something deeper, something that gnawed at her, making her hyper-aware of his presence in ways she couldn't explain. At breakfast the next morning, Sarah did her best to act normal, to play the part of the loving wife and mother. She made small talk with David and the children, but her mind was elsewhere, constantly drifting back to Gregory. Every time she looked at him, she saw something different in his gaze, a quiet intensity, a silent curiosity. It wasn't the way he spoke, nor was it the words he chose. It was the way he watched her, the way he lingered just a moment too long. Sarah felt her pulse quicken with each glance, her breath catching in her throat, as if she were caught in a web she didn't know how to escape. David, oblivious to the undercurrents that had formed between Sarah and his father, continued with his usual cheerful demeanor. He spoke animatedly about his work. The children chimed in with their weekend plans, and Sarah nodded along, but it all felt like a distant echo. Every movement Gregory made seemed to draw her in. Every word he spoke resonated more deeply than it should have. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself she was imagining things, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't her imagination. It was real, and it terrified her. Later in the day, when David and the children left the house for a few hours, Sarah found herself alone with Gregory again. The house, usually a place of comfort, now felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around her. She busied herself with cleaning, trying to find something to occupy her mind, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that every step she took brought her closer to something she wasn't ready to face. Gregory entered the room quietly, his presence almost imperceptible at first, but then she felt it, the shift in the air, the sudden heaviness that seemed to settle in the space between them. She turned slightly, pretending to focus on the task at hand, but she could feel his eyes on her just as she had felt the night before. His gaze was intense, as though he were reading her, searching for something beneath the surface that she wasn't willing to show. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, a quiet but insistent tug that pulled at her from the inside. "Sarah," Gregory said her name softly, his voice low and steady. The sound of her name coming from him sent a shiver down her spine. She hesitated for a moment before turning to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. There he was, standing just a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying a hint of something more. There was a flicker of something between them, something that neither of them had acknowledged, but that neither could deny. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Sarah's mind raced, her heart fought against the rising tide of emotion she couldn't suppress. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a dam ready to burst. Gregory's presence was like a magnet pulling her in, and she couldn't escape the feeling that something dangerous was unfolding right in front of her. She knew that this wasn't right. She knew she was betraying her own values, her own boundaries, but in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. All that mattered was the way his eyes held hers, the way his proximity made her breath catch, the way his voice seemed to reach into her soul. I don't know what to say," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory's gaze softened for a brief moment, and he took a step closer, his presence now so overwhelming that Sarah could hardly breathe. There was no more space between them, no more pretending that everything was fine. In that moment, Sarah realized that nothing would ever be the same again. She had crossed a line, and though she didn't want to admit it, she knew that the moment had arrived. The pull between them was undeniable. It was more than just attraction. It was something deeper, something that neither of them had expected, but that both of them had been pulled into the air around them, seemed to crackle with tension, and Sarah could feel her pulse racing, her mind spinning. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how to stop it, but she knew she couldn't turn back. For the first time, Sarah acknowledged the depth of her feelings. They had been hiding in plain sight, buried beneath layers of routine and normalcy, but now they had surfaced raw and exposed. And as much as she wanted to resist, to push everything away and return to the life she had known, she couldn't. Not anymore. And then, just as quickly as it had started, Gregory turned away. It was as though he had sensed the breaking point, the moment when both of them knew that the game was over. But in that brief interaction, something inside Sarah shifted irrevocably. She had tasted the forbidden, and once that door had been opened, it could never be closed again. Sarah stood there, her mind reeling, her heart heavy with emotions she didn't know how to process. As Gregory left the room, she felt a strange emptiness settle over her. But at the same time, she knew that something had changed forever, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't undo it. The days following that night felt like a blur, and Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that the world around her had changed irreparably. She tried to maintain the outward appearance of normalcy. She played her part as a wife, a mother, and a host, but inside she was unraveling. Every glance at Gregory felt like an electric shock. Every moment spent in the same room as him seemed charged with something neither of them could or would speak of. The air between them was thick with an unsaid connection, something heavy and undeniable, yet neither of them acknowledged it outright. It was as though they both understood the danger of letting it spill into words, and so they didn't. But the more Sarah tried to ignore the growing tension, the more she realized it was impossible. It wasn't a matter of mere attraction. It was something far deeper, a silent understanding that neither of them could avoid. The subtle shifts in Gregory's presence, the way he moved when he was near her, the way his gaze lingered just a fraction longer than it should, each small detail gnawed at Sarah, pulling her closer to something she was terrified to explore. That evening, when David left the house with the children for a brief outing, Sarah was once again left alone with Gregory. The house, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to be closing in around her. Every step she took, every breath she drew, felt laden with anticipation. She could almost hear her heartbeat echoing in the silence that stretched between them. She busied herself with simple tasks, trying to occupy her mind, but it was futile. Every sound, Gregory's footsteps, the rustling of his clothes reminded her of his presence, and each time her chest tightened. When he entered the room, she could feel it instantly. His presence was like a weight on her shoulders, undeniable, suffocating. She tried to focus on the dishes in front of her, pretending she didn't feel the electricity crackling between them, but it was impossible to ignore. His gaze fell on her quiet and intense, as though he was waiting for something, waiting for her to say something to make the next move to acknowledge what was happening between them. Sarah's pulse quickened, her breath becoming shallow, and she found herself unable to look away. "Sarah," he said her name, and the sound of it was enough to make her stomach flip. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something about it that set her on edge. It was as if every syllable was laced with a hidden meaning, something she couldn't quite grasp, but that felt deeply important. Turning slowly to face him, she met his eyes. There, in the quiet of the kitchen, with the setting sun casting shadows across the room, Sarah felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just the way Gregory looked at her, it was the weight of the silence that surrounded them. They stood there, locked in a stare as if time itself had stopped. In that moment, everything about Sarah's life, everything she had built felt distant, as if it were a world she could no longer touch. The desire to step back, to retreat into the safety of her normal life, was strong, but it was equally strong. The pull toward Gregory, the inexplicable force that drew her in, made her heart race. It wasn't just about wanting him. It wasn't merely about the magnetic chemistry between them. It was about something deeper, something that Sarah couldn't understand, something that felt almost predestined. Her mouth went dry, and she found herself at a loss for words. There was no escaping this moment, no running from the pull she felt toward him. She had always thought of herself as a woman who could keep her emotions in check, who could compartmentalize and maintain control. But now, all the boundaries she had carefully constructed were crumbling before her eyes. Gregory took a step closer, his movements slow, deliberate. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as he reached out and gently cupped her face, his touch sending a shock of warmth through her. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the kitchen, the house, the life she had built. There was only him and the overwhelming intensity of the moment. "Do you feel it too?" Gregory whispered, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. Sarah didn't need to answer. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his hand lingered on her skin, in the way the world outside them seemed to fade away. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say, but the truth was undeniable. She did feel it, more than she had ever felt anything in her life. The distance between them closed in an instant, and before Sarah could think, their lips met. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, as if both of them were testing the waters of a forbidden connection. But soon the kiss deepened, fueled by the pent-up desire and longing that had been growing between them for days. In that moment, Sarah was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, and the overwhelming need to give in to the pull that had brought them together. She knew it was wrong, knew it would destroy everything she had ever known, but she couldn't stop herself. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to be consumed by the moment. The world outside, the consequences, the family they had built, none of it mattered. It was just the two of them, lost in a kiss that was both passionate and dangerous. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. She stared at Gregory and he at her, both of them in shock at what they had just done. The world was no longer the same. What had started as a quiet, almost invisible connection had exploded into something neither of them could undo. As they stood there in the quiet aftermath of their kiss, Sarah realized that nothing would ever be the same. Her life, her marriage, her family, everything was at stake now, and yet despite the fear, despite the guilt that clawed at her insides, she knew that this moment had changed her forever. The path she had been walking had been altered, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were filled with a deep, almost suffocating silence between Sarah and Gregory. The world outside seemed to carry on without them, but inside nothing was the same. The kiss they had shared the moment they both had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed hung over them like a storm cloud. The weight of it was almost unbearable, yet neither of them could bring themselves to acknowledge it fully. It lingered between them unspoken, but understood a quiet tension that neither could ignore. For Sarah, each moment spent in the house felt like a slow unraveling. She was still pretending, going through the motions of daily life. She cooked, she cleaned, she spoke to David and the children with a smile, but every glance she exchanged with Gregory sent a shock through her. A reminder of the secret they now shared, a secret that threatened to destroy everything. She couldn't look at him without feeling that magnetic pull once again, that undeniable connection that was both thrilling and terrifying. But she wasn't just afraid of the consequences of their actions. She was afraid of herself. For the first time, she realized how deeply she had fallen into something that was beyond her control. She had always prided herself on being rational, on keeping her emotions in check. But with Gregory, she had lost all sense of control. There was something in his presence that disarmed her, something about him that made her forget the rules she had always lived by. At times, Sarah would catch herself wondering how it had all come to this, how a single kiss could change everything, how she had allowed herself to fall so easily into this dangerous game. The shame and guilt gnawed at her, and she found herself retreating more and more into herself, pulling away from her family, from her life, from everything she had once held dear, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feelings that had awakened inside her. The desire to be close to Gregory, to be seen by him in a way she had never been seen before, was undeniable. It was as if she had opened a door that she could never close again. Days blurred together as Sarah's internal struggle deepened. Every time she was alone with Gregory, the air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words and emotions that neither of them dared voice. They avoided eye contact, never allowing themselves to linger too long in the same space. But every brush of their hands, every quiet moment together seemed to reignite that spark. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but it was one they both seemed unable to stop. Sarah knew the consequences of what they had done, the devastation it would cause if anyone found out. But at the same time, she couldn't deny the pull, the connection that had been building between them since the first moment they had locked eyes. She was torn between her loyalty to David and the overwhelming need to explore this forbidden attraction that had taken root in her heart. One evening, when David had gone out for a late meeting and the children were asleep, Sarah found herself alone in the living room with Gregory once again. She had expected it to be like every other night, quiet, uneventful, and filled with the tension they had come to accept as normal. But this time, something was different. There was a shift in the air, a charged energy that felt almost tangible. Sarah's pulse quickened as she sat across from Gregory, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment before she quickly looked away. But it wasn't enough to escape the heat building between them. Gregory spoke first, his voice low and steady, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "Sarah," he said, her name lingering in the air, heavy with meaning. It was the same way he had said it before, but this time it was different. There was a quiet urgency in his tone, a hint of something deeper that he couldn't hide. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if her body had betrayed her, unable to form the sentences that she knew should be said. She wanted to tell him that this wasn't right, that they couldn't keep doing this, that she couldn't keep pretending everything was normal, but the words felt foreign, as though they no longer belonged to her. Instead, she found herself moving closer to him, drawn in by the magnetism she couldn't resist. Their eyes locked once again, and for a moment everything else in the world disappeared. There was no David, no children, no home, no consequences. There was only the overwhelming presence of Gregory and the fire that seemed to burn between them. The kiss came swiftly, almost as if it had been waiting to happen for far longer than either of them realized. It was desperate, frantic, even as though neither of them could stop it. Gregory's hands found Sarah's face, pulling her closer, as if he too had been waiting for this moment, unable to deny it any longer. Sarah responded without thinking, her body moving instinctively toward him. Every touch, every kiss, an explosion of emotion she had never allowed herself to feel. For a brief moment, she forgot everything, forgot the guilt, the shame, the betrayal. She was lost in the kiss, in the sensation of finally being seen, finally being desired in a way she had longed for, but never allowed herself to acknowledge. But as the kiss deepened, the reality of what they were doing began to seep back in, and Sarah pulled away, gasping for breath. She looked into Gregory's eyes, and for the first time, she saw the same uncertainty reflected back at her. He too seemed to realize what they had done, and the weight of it hit them both with full force. There was no going back now, no erasing the moment they had just shared. As they sat there in silence, Sarah knew that the path they had just walked down could never be undone. She had crossed a line and nothing would ever be the same again. The consequences of their actions loomed over them, and yet despite everything, Sarah couldn't bring herself to regret it. The connection they shared, as dangerous as it was, had ignited something deep within her, something she could never walk away from. But now she had to face the reality of it all. The game they were playing was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The morning after their kiss, Sarah woke with a heavy heart, the weight of what had transpired the night before pressing down on her. The silence in the house felt deafening, and her thoughts were a constant swirl of guilt, regret, and desire. She had betrayed her husband, her family, and her own sense of morality. There was no easy way to look at what had happened, no simple explanation for the emotion she was now grappling with. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't shake the fact that the connection between her and Gregory had deepened irrevocably in that one moment. As she moved through the motions of the day, preparing breakfast, greeting David, and helping the children with their schoolwork, it felt as though she were playing a part in a life that was no longer hers. Her body moved mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Gregory. Every glance, every movement reminded her of the intense, forbidden pull they shared. She tried to push the feelings aside, but they lingered like shadows that stretched longer with each passing moment. David, ever the devoted husband, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing inside Sarah. He spoke cheerfully about his work, asking about her plans for the day, completely unaware of the internal turmoil she was experiencing. Sarah tried her best to smile, to respond, but each word felt like a lie. She could barely focus on what he was saying, her mind constantly drifting back to Gregory and the dangerous path they were now on. The evening came, and David suggested they go for a walk, but Sarah, feeling the weight of the situation, declined. She couldn't bring herself to face the world outside the house, not with the secret that now tied her to Gregory. Instead, she stayed behind, and as the hours passed, she found herself growing more and more restless. It wasn't just the guilt that gnawed at her. It was the yearning, the ache to be near Gregory again. It was as though she were caught in a web, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. When David finally left for work the next morning and the children were at school, Sarah was left alone with Gregory once again. The house once. A place of comfort now felt like a prison. Each time she moved, each step she took, it felt as though she was walking closer to something she couldn't control. She was terrified of what might happen next, terrified of the choices she had made, but at the same time, she couldn't stop herself from wanting more. Gregory, too, seemed to be struggling with the aftermath of their kiss. His presence was quieter, now more subdued, but it was no less intense. Every time he entered a room, Sarah could feel the electricity between them, the unspoken tension that still hung in the air. It was as if they were both waiting for something to happen, but neither of them knew how to make the first move. It wasn't long before they found themselves in the same room again, this time alone with no distractions. Gregory's gaze met hers, and once again the world outside seemed to disappear. They were no longer just a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law. They were two people bound by something deeper, something more dangerous than either of them could fully understand. And yet, despite the consequences, despite the risk of everything crashing down around them, Sarah found herself taking a step closer to him. Their eyes locked, and in that instant, Sarah knew that they could never go back. Whatever had been between them before, whatever boundaries had existed, had already been crossed. There was no going back to the way things were. The pull between them was too strong, too consuming, and as much as Sarah tried to fight it, as much as she wanted to protect her family and her life, she knew that she had already made her choice. Gregory took a step toward her, his presence overwhelming. There was a quiet urgency in his movements, a longing that mirrored her own. The words she had been holding back for so long, words of guilt, words of regret, words of fear dissolved in the heat of the moment. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. They both knew what would happen next, and neither of them could stop it. The kiss they shared this time was different. It was no longer tentative, no longer hesitant. It was raw, passionate, and filled with the weight of everything they had been holding inside. There was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. In that moment, they were consumed by each other, lost in the heat of their emotions. It was everything Sarah had been longing for, and yet it was everything she knew she should never have allowed herself to feel. When they pulled apart, breathless and shaken, the reality of their actions hit them both. Sarah's heart was racing, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. She knew what they had just done was wrong. She knew it would tear her family apart if anyone found out. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of dread that settled in her chest, there was a part of her that couldn't regret it. The connection they shared, as dangerous as it was, felt too real to ignore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. They both understood the magnitude of what had just happened. The air between them was thick, with unspoken emotions, with the understanding that this was no longer just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, far more dangerous. Sarah stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. She had crossed a line, and she couldn't uncross it. And as much as she tried to hold on to her former life, she knew that the path she had chosen had already led her down a road from which there was no return. In the days following the kiss that had shattered everything, Sarah knew the house became a place of quiet chaos. Every morning she tried to act as though nothing had changed, but the weight of her actions clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She had betrayed the trust of the one person she loved most in the world, her husband David. And yet, even as guilt consumed her, she couldn't shake the undeniable connection she had felt with Gregory. Each time Gregory entered a room, Sarah felt a flicker of something dangerous stir inside her. Their eyes would meet briefly, and without saying a word, the tension between them would rise palpable and suffocating. It was no longer just about the attraction, it was about something deeper, something darker that neither of them could truly name. It was as though the kiss had opened a door between them, a door that neither of them could shut again. Sarah could feel herself slowly unraveling. She avoided David's eyes whenever possible, unable to meet his gaze without feeling the weight of the betrayal. She tried to engage with him as she always had, making conversation, doing the small tasks around the house. But everything felt off. The life they had built together now felt fragile, as though it could collapse at any moment. She knew she was walking a tightrope, every step more precarious than the last. But the truth was, she didn't know how to stop. The pull toward Gregory was like a force of nature, relentless and inescapable. She tried to push it aside to silence the yearning that seemed to grow with each passing day. But it only intensified. Every glance he gave her, every small interaction between them, fanned the flames of something forbidden. It wasn't just about the kiss anymore. It was about the secret, the shared moment that they both carried silently between them. One evening, when David had left for work and the children were at school, Sarah found herself alone with Gregory again. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of her own heartbeat, which seemed to echo in her chest. She felt the weight of what had happened between them as if it were an invisible anchor dragging her deeper into a world she didn't know how to navigate. The guilt and shame tangled with a desperate need to feel close to Gregory again, to somehow make sense of what had transpired. Gregory's presence was calming, but it only made the tension worse. There were no words between them, no acknowledgement of what they both knew had changed. The air was thick with the things they didn't say, with the feelings neither of them were willing to name. Sarah tried to keep her distance, to remain in control, but the attraction between them was undeniable. It was as if every cell in her body screamed for something she couldn't have, and the more she resisted, the more it consumed her. As Gregory moved closer, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. There was no escape this time, no turning back. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken understanding between them that something had already begun, something neither of them could stop. Her breath caught in her throat as he stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Sarah Gregory said her name softly, his voice low and steady, but with a hint of something Sarah couldn't quite place. There was a note of concern in it, but it was also laced with something else, something deeper. She could feel the words unspoken between them, the tension that had been building for days. I can't keep pretending, Sarah whispered, her voice shaky as she stepped back slightly, but she didn't go far. She didn't want to go far. Gregory didn't move, his eyes still locked on hers, his face unreadable, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes, the silent understanding that they were both trapped by their own emotions. Neither of them wanted this, at least not in the way they had let it unfold. But it was too late now. The lines had already been crossed, the damage already done. She realized in that moment that she wasn't just torn between loyalty to David and desire for Gregory. She was torn between the life she had built, one of safety, routine, and stability, and the chaos of the emotions she had never allowed herself to feel. In a twisted way, this affair was both a release and a curse. It had brought her closer to a part of herself she had long buried beneath the weight of responsibility and motherhood. But it had also taken her to the edge of something that threatened to tear everything apart. I don't know what's happening anymore, Sarah admitted, her voice thick with emotion. She could feel the tears welling in her eyes, though she fought them back. But I can't stop it. I can't stop this feeling. Gregory reached out his hand, brushing against her arm in a gesture that was both gentle and filled with longing. I don't want to hurt you, Sarah, he said, his voice full of quiet regret, but I don't know how to stop either. The silence between them stretched long, and Sarah felt her heart pounding, her breath shallow. She wanted to pull away to run from what had been set in motion, but she couldn't. Something inside her had changed, something that wouldn't go back to the way it was before. The more she tried to fight it, the deeper the pull became. She was trapped in this web, spun between desire and guilt, unable to escape the consequences of her own choices. At that moment, Sarah understood that there would be no simple resolution to this, no easy way out. She had crossed a line, and now she would have to face the consequences. But for the first time, she also knew she couldn't turn away from the path she had started to walk. The weight of the situation hung heavy on her shoulders, and though it filled her with dread, she could no longer deny that she had chosen this, and now she had to live with it. As the days passed, Sarah felt the weight of her actions growing heavier, like an anchor dragging her deeper into a sea of uncertainty. She tried to carry on with her life, making breakfast for David and the children, handling the mundane tasks that filled her days, but it all felt hollow, as if she were playing a role in a life that was no longer hers. Every moment spent in the house was filled with a suffocating tension, and the quiet between her and Gregory only amplified the storm brewing inside her. The connection they shared, a bond that had begun with a forbidden kiss, was something neither of them could erase. Every glance they exchanged, every brush of their hands seemed to pull her deeper into the web of emotions that neither of them could untangle. It wasn't just the guilt that weighed on Sarah, it was the realization that the spark between them had become more than just a fleeting attraction. It was something real, something undeniable, and it terrified her. She had never thought of herself as a woman capable of such betrayal. She had always prided herself on being loyal, on keeping her commitments. But now, with each passing day, she found herself drifting further away from the woman she once was. The guilt was paralyzing. She knew what she had done, what it meant for her family. She knew that if anyone found out, it would destroy everything David, the man she had loved for so many years, would never forgive her. The thought of losing him, of losing the life they had built together, made her sick to her stomach. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't stop thinking about Gregory, a part of her that couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him, the quiet magnetism that seemed to draw her in no matter how hard she tried to resist. David was still oblivious to the storm brewing within their home. He continued to go to work to carry on with his life, completely unaware of the fracture in their relationship. Sarah was haunted by the thought of him finding out, of seeing the disappointment in his eyes. But it wasn't just the fear of losing him that consumed her. It was the realization that she had changed, that she had allowed herself to fall into a situation that had completely unraveled her sense of self. She no longer recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. One evening, after David had left for a late meeting and the children were tucked into bed, Sarah found herself alone with Gregory once again. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, now felt cold and unfamiliar. She was trapped in a cycle of emotions she didn't know how to escape. The guilt, the desire, the fear, it all swirled inside her, threatening to swallow her whole. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, the silence of the house pressing in on her as she sat in the living room, waiting for Gregory to make the next move. When he entered the room, Sarah could feel it immediately, the shift in the air, the undeniable tension between them. It was like a weight had descended upon her chest, making it hard to breathe. She looked up at him, and for a moment everything else disappeared. There was no David, no children, no life outside this moment. There was only Gregory and the powerful connection they shared, a connection that was both dangerous and exhilarating. Sarah, he said her name softly, but it was filled with a quiet urgency. It was a voice she had heard before, but this time it held something more, something that spoke to the very core of her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she wondered if she could even speak. She knew what was happening, knew that this moment, like every other moment they had shared, was leading them further down a path they could not return from. But she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't pull away. Gregory stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. She could feel the intensity in his gaze, the pull of his presence, and for the first time she felt completely exposed. He reached for her, his hand brushing against her cheek and her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to stop the feelings that had taken over her. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It was as though the floodgates had opened and everything she had been holding inside came rushing out all at once. "I don't know how to undo what we've done." Gregory's hand lingered on her cheek for a moment before he gently pulled her closer. "We can't undo it, Sarah," he said, his voice low and filled with a quiet intensity. "But we can't keep pretending either." The truth of his words hit Sarah like a wave crashing against the shore. She couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't go back to the life she had known, not after everything that had happened. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. For so long she had tried to bury her feelings to ignore the pull toward Gregory, but now with his hand on her cheek and his eyes locked on hers, she knew that she could never go back. In that moment, Sarah understood the true cost of her choices. The life she had built, the family she had loved, had been irrevocably altered, and though she had once believed that she could control her own fate, she now realized that there were some things beyond her control. There were some desires, some connections that couldn't be ignored, no matter the consequences. As Gregory's lips met hers, once again, Sarah felt a rush of emotions overwhelm her. The guilt was still there, the fear of what would come next. But in that moment, it was all drowned out by the intensity of the kiss, the raw emotion that had been building between them. She knew that nothing would ever be the same and that the consequences of their actions would follow them for the rest of their lives. But as she kissed him back, she also knew that for better or for worse, this was the path she had chosen, and there was no turning back.